just working on management. I will introduce myself in a second. The first thing is to show you the overall program for the whole week. I think you have it. All the presentations have been placed on Moodle, so if there's something you miss or if there's something I miss out, you can always find them out there.
Okay.
So 5 days. Today it's in the afternoon 7 to 2. All the other days it's in the morning 7 to 10. Today I will have to release you at 4:30, and I can't keep you longer because I understand you have another class coming up afterwards. And the other days, we'll see. If you have 5 minutes, you'll tell me. In principle, I'd like you to have 5 minutes.
For tomorrow and Thursday.
And Thursday as well. Okay. So today it's the first introduction, first who's who. That should be pretty fast. European Space Agency. I work with the European Space Agency. You'll hear a hell of a lot about the European Space Agency, and there for several reasons. One reason is that it's a big player in space in Europe. It may or may not be obvious, but it is. Another reason is I'm here also a bit to promote the European Space Agency. I hope that we'll make of you, all of us collectively, very competent people so that you can work in the space industry, or maybe, who knows, for the European Space Agency, or at least with the European Space Agency when you're somewhere in industry or whatever institutions in Europe. And therefore, the purpose of my being here, being sent by ESA here, is also not only to make you aware of the activities of ESA, but also trying to put some oil in the whole mechanism of your working with us, one way or the other. ESA is pretty much always there somewhere in the picture. I'll tell you a lot about various types of space projects. So not only I'll talk a lot about ESA, but I will also talk first-hand experience about a lot of ESA projects. First of all, because I know them well, those I will put the most emphasis on, and I will try to convey some experience with that about them. In particular, science projects I will talk mostly about, at least today. After that, a little bit less. The reason is, one, that's those I know best. Two, they're the most exciting. Three, they're good conversation with friends. And that's enough reasons, I guess. There are even more reasons for that. Yes, one more. It's the science directorate at ESA is the one with the highest prestige. So, for a good reason. So, all right, so this is for day one. Day two will continue a bit with comparing various types of space projects and why it makes it different for the project manager. So I'll be speaking from the point of view of the project manager, that I hope you'll be at some point, to see what the challenges are and the difficulties the project manager encounters. Doesn't mean that you'll all have to be the project managers of the ESA project, but it's, again, good that you know how it works, so that you understand, if you're the project manager, obviously, if you're not the project manager, why the project manager functions the way she or he functions. Also, the specifics of the ESA context. Here again, you may or may not be at ESA or directly with ESA later on. The specifics of how it works between ESA and other institutions is very important, because then you understand the dynamics, how things are organized. This will be, by the way, today also quite technical. I will try to go in as much technical detail as I can, even a bit of science, not that much, but a little bit. And again, it's to give you an appreciation for what's at stake here. I'm not talking about just the run-of-the-mill industry. We're also not talking about the run-of-the-mill spacecraft. We're talking about really advanced stuff. So it's to give you an appreciation for how difficult it is. All right. Also, a few words about public procurement. ESA and most space agencies, not all, are public institutions or semi-public institutions, which brings with it a lot of constraints, like university, by the way. You can't just do anything you like with public money. And of course, other institutions have different constraints about that. And sometimes there are projects which are done in cooperation on an interface or various things at interface, which complicates matters, and you should have an understanding of that. Again, even if you don't actually do it yourself, but you should have an understanding of what those constraints are, so you understand how the whole thing is functioning. Then the next day we'll talk about a bit how we address complexity in a space project. It's something which actually is not seminal to space projects only. It's also lots of other projects which are also very complex, but on space projects it's absolutely indispensable to manage complexity, and I'll show you what the usual tools are. Risk management is also rather well known, and space standardization. I'll spend quite a bit of time in space standardization. If it bores you to tears, you'll tell me, and then maybe I'll make it a bit shorter, or I won't, because where it goes. And after that, we'll have space project team building and management. It's very, very important. First, we're going to project manager. If you have not built the team properly, then the project will go nowhere. And then on the last day, we'll take a bit of a look at new space. I don't know how many of you have heard about what's called general new space or not. We'll have some discussion about that. It's a fresh, relatively fresh topic, so I guess if you have inputs also, it's also for discussion. We'll propose a lot of things, but if you have inputs, it's also you will see that the content, you see it at the size of the presentation, is very heavy in the first couple of days. If I don't manage to present and talk about everything I wanted today, I'll just continue tomorrow. The last days are much lighter until now. So it means there is time later on, if here we get late, I'll just move things around. Or I'll just park it for a minute, do whatever, and come back to it. So there are buffers in there. Not today, but in the following days. Okay. Also for the logistics, so again, today we start at 2, all the other days we start at 10. We have, in principle, 3 hours per session. In reality, it's a bit shorter because it's actually 3 times 3/4 of an hour. We will have a break after 3/4 of an hour, and then a second break again after 3/4 of an hour of lecturing, simply because I can't do without a break at some point. So we'll do 3/4 of an hour, 1/4 of an hour break, 3/4 of an hour, 1/4 of an hour break. All right, so that's for the organization, the overall content. And now, well, who's this person who's been talking to you? You'll give me your names until now you can have my name. This is me. I'm an old timer by now, since I was born in 57. I guess you don't know when that was, but it's way before you were born. I'm a Frenchman, but I've been residing in the Netherlands for a long time, for 33 years. I've got a couple of academic credentials. I've been to a couple of places. I worked in space for all those institutions, including in French Vienna, the launch site of the European Space Agency, which I will talk also about later. And at the European Space Agency, you can imagine in the course of 33 years, I've been in various places. So I've what I consider been quite a background in the technicalities of development, and then several projects, including XMM Newton, which is an extra observatory, which I will talk more about, which has been in space for 20 years, which will be 20 years in December, working very well. Rosetta was a very, very exciting project, so I'll tell you more than you want to know about this. Planck as well. I'll say less about Planck, but it's a nice project. Solar Orbiter is the greatest of them all, so I'll tell you also about this one. And now I'm in the Inspector General's office, where I do see a lot of things at the agency, which is also a nice thing to do. All right. Questions? No questions. Very good. We proceed. So, I guess there are 12 of you in principle. I don't see 12, but okay. I guess some of them have fallen by the wayside in the meantime. I hope that all 12 of you here when I say, do tell your colleagues that they don't show up that this is nice and that they should show up.
Okay.
I'll give you a lot of pretty pictures. That's why also the presentation is very heavy. A lot of these are projects. Now, in one of the assignments, I don't know, did you discuss the assignments with Maria Holofe? No, you didn't. Okay, so we'll do that. We're not going to do it today, but if we have time to do it tomorrow, latest Wednesday. One of the assignments is compare some projects with similar projects from other agencies. For this, you need to know what the ESA projects are, and here you have a lot of ESA projects that therefore you can think about, say, okay, I'll take this one, I think that I know something elsewhere that is somewhat similar, so etc. So I'm showing you all this, also as reference material so that you can go back to that and say, okay, these are the projects that that's been told us about, and this is how we can use it. It's not a threat, it's just to tell you it can be useful. Okay. After that, I'll also use a lot of dry text, factual text. This is the performance, this is that. So don't fall asleep. If you fall asleep, don't snore. Don't want to disturb the others. You don't have to learn all this by heart. It's not a matter of memorization. So it's just a reference material. There's lots of stuff, but you don't have to learn it. You have to see it, build with it, and work with it. Okay, so a lot of stuff about ISA. All right, we're actually starting a bit by the end, because we first saw a picture of a rocket on a launch pad. ESA is doing a lot of things, and it's actually calling itself Europe's gateway to space, or the Space Agency of Europe and everything. You'll understand in a minute why it's not completely obvious that what the role of ESA is. It used to be obvious, now it's a little bit less obvious. There are 22 member states. We're about 5,000 people working there as staff, and then there's also 5,000 contractors on top of that. So it's not a huge organization compared to big companies, which have 100,000, 200,000 people. Even space companies, it's not that big, 5,000. But again, we like to think of ourselves as being at the center of the web, so therefore it's not unimportant. ESA works only for purposes. You'll see security, safety, and this kind of words later on in my presentations. It does not refer to defense at any time. Now, of course, what's built by ESA and the technologies which are developed can be used for military purposes. It's like trucks. You can develop trucks in the industry, and you paint it green. The military use it, it's military truck. So this can also happen with things that ESA develops, but ESA does not have defense activity. Contrary to some national space agencies, like the French, for instance, which do take on military things on behalf of their national governments or national ministries of defense, things like that. ESA doesn't do that. The headquarters of ESA is in Paris. But actually, there are not that many people working in Paris. It's headquarters. It's between 200 and 300 people. You've seen the number of 5,000 before, so most people are elsewhere. Several sites around Europe, and the spaceport in French Guiana, which we mentioned before. How much money are we talking about? Not too far from 6 billion euros a year. So here again, if you compare that with a car company or things like this, it's pretty modest. And of course, this does not go to the salaries of the 5,000 people, or only a small part of this. Most of this is actually contracts which are placed in industry, which make the whole space industry work in Europe. So what does it do? ESA is quite remarkable because actually among the space agencies, it's one of the most complete, the most versatile. It does things in pretty much every area of the space sector. And okay, world leader in science and technology. It's not just a mantra. It's actually true, not everywhere, not for everything. But actually, when you look at it, and I hope you will at some point, you'll see that with the money we have and the number of people we have, we actually do a hell of a lot. If you compare dollar for euros, things like that, if you compare with the US or other places, we do a lot of things with these people in the room. We're not really newcomers on the block. This has started actually in the early 70s, but building on agencies which are even in existence before that, since the 60s. So we're talking about a good 50 years, going on 60 years of experience. So pretty much nearly since the beginning of the space age.
Do you develop, the ESA develops the satellite, or it's outsourced to some?
Well, both, if you like. I'll show you a bit more about it, but it means essentially we what you call outsource is we contract out the development to European industry for most satellites, but nevertheless the management, the top of the pyramid is ESA. So yeah, there's always, and who's the project manager? Usually you see on TV an interview with the project manager of Rosetta. Okay, But you could have several, because there's the project manager at ESA, the project manager at
Yeah.
there, the project manager at Airbus, and there's a whole bunch of people. But ESA is the top organization in there. It acts as a customer in any case, and even upstream, ESA does the mission definition to answer the needs as written by the scientific community in the case of science. All right, and also by now, more than 200 launches from Google. When I started in the business, I think it was launch number 16 a while ago. This tells you how old I am. Yeah. So originally there were just 10 member states, now there are 22. Just also to show you, you've all heard about Brexit. The United Kingdom is Brexiting, but it's not leaving the European Space Agency. So it means for the status of the United Kingdom in the European Space Agency, no difference. To that, the Brexit may make a difference for the staff are there or something like this, but it's not leaving the European Space Agency. That's one. The other thing I wanted to mention is that actually there are at least two members which are a member of the European Space Agencies and not of the European Community. These are Switzerland and Norway, were members of the European Space Agency, not of the European Community. So actually the United Kingdom will have, I guess, sort of a similar status to Switzerland and Norway, as far as the European Space Agency is concerned. Members, not members of the European Union. So let's talk a bit about what we do when we look towards the Earth. Here, nevertheless, first again a picture of the Amazon jungle. And this is actually not the launch pad, this is a test stand where the big side boosters of the Ariane launch vehicles are tested. But it's also a nice picture which I thought would give you some idea of what's at stake. These are buildings where pieces of rocket or spacecraft are being prepared. And so there are test stands, launch pads, and everything a bit far from the Earth. Right, so you know what that is by now. This is a Vega launch vehicle, smaller launch vehicle of the European Space Agency, which is in the launch pad there. This is an Ariane 5, which is the current one, which is getting towards the end of its operational life, and it's going to be, in the coming years, replaced with the next generation Ariane 6.
Next generation what?
The next generation of heavy launch vehicle will be Ariane 6, which is the successor to Ariane 5. So Ariane 5 became operational around 2000. It flew before, but unfortunately the first flight was a failure. And then after that it's launched more than 100 times. And it will be in operation for another 2-3 years. And Ariane 6 is actually now coming online. The development is slowly coming to an end. This is something with a lift off with a big logo, but I guess the sound doesn't make much difference. Now, to move from the launches to the technical developments, the big technical center of the European Space Agency is located in the Netherlands. That's why I've been there for 33 years. And there's all kinds of stuff in there. There's a lot of specialists in pretty much every specialty which is useful in space, plus a lot of big test facilities. The reason that the test facilities are at ESA is that they're very expensive things to build and to operate, and the idea is that they can then be offered at a price to not only the ESA teams, but also all the industrial teams that want to test their spacecraft, so they come directly to us. It's not the only test area in Europe for spacecraft, but it's the biggest one. Actually, you see here one of the big test facilities. You see a spacecraft bit lower than one of the big test facilities, which is a thermal chamber. This is the top of the thermal chamber. The spacecraft is going to be lowered in there, put on adapters and everything. The cap is going to come on top of that. And the pool of vacuum. There's a sun simulator on one side. The panels here are cooled with liquid nitrogen to represent cold space and can do thermal testing. So you can imagine that this kind of facilities is actually humongous. You see how big it is. Normally in the lab, like in the university or things like this, there's a thermal vacuum chamber which would be about this diameter. That's a classic, and there's no sun. Here you have the sun and this huge thing to put a whole spacecraft. So test facilities are very important for the space industry in Europe, and it costs a lot of money. By the way. Remember this when you're project manager. The development costs money. Lots of things cost a lot of money. But when you start using this sort of facility, the money spigot is wide open. So if you mess up one test of 2 days, your bill is going to be very high. Here we jump from ESTEC in the Netherlands to Germany, to the access center in Darmstadt. That's where we have the control room. So I guess you all know the NASA equivalent, Houston. So when we call it, we have a problem, we say Darmstadt with a equivalent. That's several control areas in the rooms here. And ESAC also is at the top of the control chain for the ground stations, which are either owned or operated by the European Space Agency. ESAC employs also about 300 people. At ESTEC, it's 3,500. All right, and here, as I said, there are also ground stations, some of them belonging to the ESA network, some of them being operated or used in cooperation with the ESA network. So it says here, network with space antennas. I don't particularly like that. I didn't write this myself. It's not just the antennas. These are the antennas and this spectacular thing, but it's actually ground stations. So you have, aside from the antennas, there's a whole thing, not only to drive the antennas, but also the whole data acquisition and treatment chain, which is behind them, and the whole telemetry chain, which is going the other way, to communicate with the spacecraft and command the spacecraft from there. All right, let's go back to what it is that all this has been used for science and exploration to begin with. And at the beginning of ESA, this was the largest activity. No, it's not the largest, but as I said, it's the most prestigious and best. There's a whole bunch of spacecraft which have been launched already, and in there you see that there are several kinds. There are things which are looking at planets elsewhere, like Bepi-Colombo, which was launched in 2018. This one is doing solar system inquiries. Now, Venus Express will come in that category. Giotto was a Comet spacecraft, Comet rendezvous spacecraft back in the 90s. Worked on that launch as well. But you see that there are others which are not like this. For instance, SOHO, which is still in operation, despite its 24 years, was a spacecraft which was looking at the sun. So it's a Solar Orbiter is in that same category. Proba 3 is a technology spacecraft, so that's not actually really science, but it's more development of technology. And Cassini-Huygens, this is also something Huygens landed on Titan, which is an absolutely amazing feat, which I think should have gotten more publicity. So you see a lot of things here which are exploration of the solar system. You see things which are astronomy, and you see things which are physics. So in science, in space, or in the science activities, there are really 3 different scientific communities which are served. Again, astronomy, so the spacecraft is there and looks at the stars, for instance, astrometry with Hipparcos, okay, this one. You have solar systems going to the planets, doing the stuff of which Hollywood movies are made, in, say, Mercury, Mars, and all that stuff. And the spacecraft that do physics, like LISA and LISA Pathfinder and all those, which were looking at gravitational waves or physics developments in space. All right, so this is another way of looking at things which are rather similar, but you'll notice something very important. This is this. You know? This is the electromagnetic spectrum. So there are spacecraft, which, in particular telescopes, but it's also valid for some others, which have different instruments depending on what part of the electromagnetic spectrum they're looking at. And it's very, very important to understand when you look at how missions are selected and what it is that they will do. So in here you have microwave, submillimeter, you're getting to infrared. So this is the very low frequencies, very low energy. And then you get into the visible or optical. So for instance, Gaia and astrometry you do in the visible. But then you have the higher energy spacecraft, IUE, which has been off for a long time now. Exosat was also an X-ray precursor. XMM looking at the sources of X-ray. And as you know, from your physics classes, when you look at the spectrum, at different pieces of the spectrum, you get a very different story. Some sources are extremely bright in the visible, and really nothing else. A good example is the sun. When the sun does it, but also elsewhere. But of course, by definition, nearly, that's how our eyes evolve. Most of the energy of the sun is expelled invisible. But there are many other objects in the sky which are very different from that. So it's very important to also have missions which go and look at the high energies like integral, XM I mentioned before, and also at the low energies such as Herschel, Planck, all those looking at either the close infrared or the far infrared.
I guess the very right part, the gravitational spectrum, is not part of the light spectrum.
Anything which is electromagnetic is electromagnetic. Now, of course, gravitational wave is something else, yes.
Okay.
At this point, you can wonder whether you're talking about electromagnetic waves or not. Wave particle duality, and in there it becomes very exotic. What I said, I think, remains true. If you want to stop it here, this is already gamma rays of integral is very, very far up the very high energy spectrum. So again, different types of science to be done in space, and where are you on the spectrum is very important. Several spacecraft will have several different instruments, which will then give you trouble because you'll have different requirements depending on where you are in the spectrum. All right, so a few things which are really nice. I hope that you've heard before about Rosetta, which encountered Comet 67P in 2014 and flew with it for a couple of years. If you have not heard of it, I'll come back to that in a minute. And of course, what we're doing, also in particular with Planck, this is the Planck spacecraft here, is to look at what happened at the origin of the universe. There are many, many science projects which tell you and try to get funded by saying, oh, we'll look back to the origin of the universe. So you may get tired of it at some point when the next project again comes and says, oh, we'll look back in time to what happened at the origin of the universe. Nevertheless, it's true. The deeper you can look at the universe, as you know, with the expansion of the universe, the deeper you can look, the more back at something which was original in time you look. So therefore, the cosmology aspect is very important and is also part of what the science community wants ESA to look at, and therefore that ESA looks at. This is planetology. Obviously, it's Mars exploration. This does not exist yet. It's not yet. This is a conscious view. Sometime we hope to be able to do this. The Americans have done that a few times already successfully. Mars is a very difficult environment. So usually it fails, sometimes it works. Yes?
Just a question for planetary research. Different than the moon, I would say. Does it has to be passed by ESA, or can a private firm? I mean, if a private firm wants to launch something.
So I don't think there's any law that says that ESA has to be in the loop if you want to send something, a scientific spacecraft. Actually, there are national agencies which do it without ESA. And probably private companies can do that. However, there are still international rules. Protection of planetary bodies. If you want to go and pollute some protected planetary body, they're not going to let you do that. And this is because of international treaties. And international treaties actually have precedence on national legislation, and national legislation does apply to every company. So, if your question was, do you have to go through ESA for things like this? The answer is no, in principle. But in practice, it's very difficult to do it without ESA at all, because how do you talk to those international bodies without having some kind of national and very often European-wide back. That said, I'm pretty sure that ESA would be very cooperative. If a company comes and says, I want to do such and such science in space, but I need you to do the regulatory aspect for me, or let's have a cooperation, something like this, I'm sure that ESA will be interested. That's quite possible.
So each national space agency is independent of the ESA, right?
Yeah, actually, if you like, and I'll come back also to that, the European national agencies are stakeholders of ESA. They're our customers, really. So various governments put money into ESA, and very often they do that via their space agencies. DLR, for instance, receives money from the Bundesregierung and then gives part of that money to ESA, and then sits on the council of ESA, on all the body to decide what ESA has to do and how it sits on there to make sure, to see to it that it's done the way they want. So we have countless administrative bodies which are representing the member states in various capacities, scientific, procurement, legal, many others, industrial, where the member states control that we're doing what they want. So in that sense, we're not really independent, if you like. They're not working for us. We're working for them.
Yeah.
All right. So next thing is human spaceflight. So as you know, we don't in Europe have the capability to launch our own astronauts. We toyed with that a bit in the early 90s. There were a couple of projects, but we soon realized that actually it was much too much for the resources that we have, both technically and financially. So we do have human spaceflight activities, but we do that in cooperation with both Russia and the United States. Maybe someday, maybe even with other, like the Chinese and the Indians, but not yet. All of this I'm going to tell you several times in any case, so I'll go back to that. Applications. So essentially applications is everything which has some usefulness to it. So what's useful, everything is useful, but the immediate uses that you can feel and touch on Earth are numerous. Essentially they fall in three broad categories. One is telecommunications, commercially it's the biggest part. The other is Earth observation. So instead of having a spacecraft that looks outside to the universe and whatever, the spacecraft looks at the Earth and provides pictures and analysis of what's going on with the Earth. And the other, which is a bit smaller but very important and very well known, is navigation with the GPS, Galileo, Beidou, and all those systems which help navigation, timekeeping, and all that. All right, so looking at the Earth, of course, lately, the last few years, there's a lot of talk about the environment and the climate change and a lot of things which need measurements. We need a lot of measurements to be able to understand what we can and cannot do. First of all, what's going on? It's all very nice to say, oh, yeah, well, climate change, but how much is it? Where is it? What's happening? It takes a hell of a lot of measurements to do that. So we build a lot of spacecraft to look at what's going on. It can be simply air quality, like it says here. So we have sounders, which are with very delicate instruments optimized for air quality mapping, or it can be something very different. Right? If there's a flood, of course, all the emergency agencies want to know where is it flooded, how deep is it, what's the precipitation. That's very immediate use of Earth observation to help the emergency services all over the world. And ESA does a hell of a lot of that. There are a lot of commercial services that do that, but there are also tons and tons of data available from ESA in particular. And not only over Europe, over the global cover. Right, for meteorology, of course, it's pretty obvious that it's the case on a daily basis. Okay, and actually that's also just showing you the type of spacecraft. This is a big solar array, but sometimes you have to be careful that big things which are extended like this are not always solar arrays. Sometimes they're antennas for synthetic aperture radars or other things. But here it is a solar array. So this is from the Sentinel series of spacecraft looking at the Earth. computer is getting slow. My apologies for the slowness of changing slides. So let's move to telecommunications. This is European data relay system. Now, so I guess you all know about the big application, which is telecommunications, particular geostationary telecoms. Does everybody know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about it comes out? So since the 60s, this has been a huge application. Also, already from the beginning, there were telecommunication spacecraft that were not geostationary, such as the Molniya series of spacecraft in the Soviet Union. Today, there are also many more projects about non-geostationary telecommunication spacecraft, lower Earth orbit. But until today, at least, the vast majority of telecommunication spacecraft are geostationary at 36,000 kilometers in the air. I'm not going to describe again why geostationary and why 26,000. Go to your systems engineering class for that, or actually, if you have questions, come to me after, but it's not the primary subject. European data relay satellite. Why is it a specific example of telecommunications? Because you can imagine that all those spacecraft that are looking at the Earth are producing tons and tons of data. Spacecraft are very powerful these days. The instruments are very powerful. They produce gigabytes of data per day. That's very difficult to manage in small ground stations, especially since many of the Earth observation spacecraft are only in visibility of their ground station for a short amount of time per orbit. Typically, an Earth observation spacecraft will have an orbit which will be 90 minutes, 100 minutes, and it keeps going, and then it will have typically 2 or 3 times 10 minutes of visibility from its ground station, and then it has to dump all the data which collected over the whole orbit. So it's a humongous amount of data. Data relay satellites are there to try and alleviate this problem by enabling Earth observation spacecraft, among others, to bring their data to this one. And this one is a geostationary spacecraft that then has permanent contact with its ground station and can dump a lot of data at the same time. Right? So we can do all kinds of combinations like this between Earth observation, telecommunications, aside from the classic telecommunications technologies. My computer is not going to crash, but okay, let's see. So this is a bit of an illustration of what I was saying, that you can do all kinds of combinations with the spacecraft in various orbits. Now, this is actually showing something completely different, which is the Galileo constellation. This is the navigation I was talking about. So these are in orbits which are lower than the geostationary. There's no reason to put them in geostationary orbit. Usually navigation spacecraft are in orbits which are about 20,000 kilometer altitude or less. And the technology challenges there are very different. Here it's a matter of extremely accurate timekeeping. All the spacecraft have atomic clock on board. It's not nuclear. It's nothing nuclear. It's called atomic because it's the technology of the clock. But there's nothing nuclear about them. And of course, ESA is building the Galileo network on behalf of the European Commission. This is also something I'll come back later to try and give you a glimpse on how the European Union, in practice the European Commission, is channeling funds to ESA for ESA to develop the spacecraft, produce at least the initial spacecraft for things like Galileo. And since ESA rules imposed by the member states are quite different from the EU rules, which is usually the same member states, but they have different rules in the EU than in ESA, they have a management problem. I'll come back to that. Sometimes. Safety and security. I said at the beginning that ESA does not do anything military, nor anything defense, nor anything security in the sense of defense. But here, safety and security does not mean defense. It means space weather, it means the risk of being hit by an asteroid. So these are activities which are actually not very large. You would think that this could be the top activity of a big space agency. They're actually a bit marginal, but nevertheless, there's an activity there. So the first thing to do is, of course, to understand what's coming our way, what's in the story, what's it coming, what are the risks, how do you quantify things. If you can go there, study it and see whether, if ever there was one coming our way, our methods to deflect it. Or first you have a lot of science to do to understand what can and cannot be done, what should and shouldn't be done for any of the little bodies of the solar system. All right, you thought it was over. No, we'll go back. We'll do that again. What's the time? 2:45? Is it time for a break? We'll show 2 more diagrams just to give you an idea. Space transportation I've talked to you about before. I'll do it again. It's about the launch vehicles that take all the spacecraft from there. And there's a whole family of launch vehicles developed by us. Do you remember, do you know when the first Ariane 1 launch was performed? Christmas Eve, 1979. So it's 24th December. And it was a success to everybody's surprise. So 1979 to today, that's 40 years. It's going to be 40 years in total, just to give you the whole range. Since the Ariane 1 program, then we've had the more powerful but more or less same technology Ariane 2, 3, and even 4, which was improved but more or less the same type of thing. Then Ariane 5 was a complete departure, it was a completely different launch vehicle. And now we're going into Ariane 6, which is somewhere different, but more or less similar technologies with improvements. Next generation, that is. All right, we'll take a 15-minute break. Come back at 2 to 3. We'll continue.